This is the case of Susan and Christopher Edwards and the bodies in the garden. It was October 2013 when Christopher Edwards called his stepmother Elizabeth and asked her for some money. The request was somewhat surprising, given that Christopher and his wife had moved from London to France a year prior. And when asked why, Christopher made a strange admission. They'd been forced to flee the country because of a series of shocking events. By the end of that conversation, Christopher's stepmother Elizabeth hung up the phone and called the police. She said that they should send an investigative team directly to 2 Blenheim Close in Forest Town, Nottinghamshire. Upon excavation of the lawn at the rear of the property, 2 bodies were discovered. The remains were later identified as William and Patricia Wycherley, Christopher's mother and father-in-law, and they had been concealed there for over 15 years. This discovery was all the more disturbing because until only a few months earlier, William and Patricia, the deceased, had been alive and well. William Wycherley had married Patricia Moore in the late 1950s at Fulham Registry Office in London. Their only child, Susan, was born months later. As a teenager, Susan inherited £10,000 following the death of her grandfather. And rather than squander the money, she took her mother on a visit to Graceland. The remaining sum, which was £5,000, was put towards a house which she co-purchased with her parents in London. Now, when she was 20, Susan met and eventually married Christopher Edwards. It was said that they met via a dating agency, a fact which they both found really embarrassing and attempted to conceal without success. So it's also worth noting that Susan's father disliked Christopher from the start, which caused quite a rift in the family. Now, in 1986, Susan's parents persuaded her to sign away her half of the house, enabling them to sell it and move into 2 Blenheim Close in Forest Town. Now, Susan and Christopher didn't keep in regular contact with her parents, and they visited them only very occasionally. But during one such visit in 1992, there was a very heated argument, and when the pair left, Christopher would later claim it was the last time he ever saw the Wycherleys. The family unit was now effectively estranged. Neighbours of the Wycherleys described the couple as reserved and very reclusive, adding that it was rare they saw them at all. It was hardly surprising then that in 1997, when the Wycherleys all but disappeared, people believed that they had moved away. The truth, however, was much more sinister. On the May bank holiday of that year, Susan and Christopher visited the Wycherleys. They murdered them and they buried them under the lawn in the back garden. Accounts were different, but the Edwards version of events first stated that Susan had gone alone to her parents. Had woken early on Sunday morning to a loud bang. She entered her parents' bedroom. She found her father slumped on the floor and her mother standing over him, holding a revolver. Argument ensued, in which Susan claimed her mother admitted to having had an affair with Christopher, Susan's husband. Appalled and flying into a sudden rage, Susan then shot her mother, fled the house, and called Christopher in a panic from a phone box. She did return briefly to the house, wrapped the bodies in blankets, and hid them under the bed. According to the couple, they returned the following weekend, and Susan stated that they stopped to buy fish and chips en route, that Susan finally told Christopher what had happened the weekend prior, and that the bodies were still upstairs. For his part, Christopher said that he agreed to help Susan dispose of the bodies of his in-laws because he believed her account of the events and didn't want to throw her to the wolves by going to the police. Susan admitted in court that they watched the Eurovision Song Contest on television before dragging the bodies downstairs into the garden in the middle of the night. From that day on, in 1998, right until things began to unravel in 2012, the Edwards conducted an elaborate ruse to convince the world that Patricia and William Wycherley were still alive. The day after the bodies were concealed, Susan went to the bank in Mansfield and withdrew all the money that she could from her parents' joint account. She then closed those accounts and opened a new one, a joint account in her name and in her mother's name, with all the correspondence still going to the Wycherley address. During the next 15 years, the pair systematically stole money, forged signatures to continue receiving benefits, obtained control of pension plans, and took out loans and credit cards in the Wycherleys' names. Now, the total exceeded £250,000, which actually included the sale of 2 Blenheim Close in 2005, the property where the Wycherleys' remains were buried. Neighbours and relatives were told that the Wycherleys had gone travelling and were staying by the coast for health reasons. In 2007, Susan wrote to relatives explaining that her parents had sold their house and were touring Ireland because of the good air, and that they might decide to settle there permanently. In 2011, she sent a really chatty Christmas card to another relation explaining, "Yes, I realise my father travelled the world in younger years. Well, it is like he is having his second youth now, because when he does speak, now he speaks of travel and travelling. I cannot really keep up with where he's planning to settle. He and Mum like to travel in the Irish Republic, particularly. I tend to think it is a yearning for past years to do all the things that one never got around to before. But it is good to see them with such zest." So how were the couple eventually caught? Well, the Edwards might have got away with their crimes if it hadn't been for the fact that they made several ridiculous decisions. Mr. Wycherley, had he actually been alive, would have been approaching his 100th birthday. And so in 2012, the couple received a letter from the Centenarian Society, which is a prestigious organisation aimed at recognising and celebrating those people about to reach that 100th milestone birthday. So as is customary, they requested a face-to-face meeting with Mr. Wycherley. They hurriedly raised £5,000 from selling books and other items. They borrowed £10,000 from Christopher's work and fled to an apartment in Lille, France. Now, after several months, they continued to struggle financially, and this leads us back to the start of the story, where Christopher rings his stepmother and asks her for some money and tells her about the events 15 years prior, that Susan had shot her mother and that they had buried her parents in the back garden. After the police had been informed and the plot behind 2 Blenheim Close excavated and the bodies retrieved and eventually identified, the investigation quickly became a murder inquiry. Detectives tried to contact the couple's daughter, Susan, but without any success. The British police force, having no jurisdiction in France, were fairly limited in their capacity to locate and question the Edwards. However, not 2 weeks after the start of the investigation, the lead detective on the case found an email sitting in his inbox, marked urgent. It was from Christopher Edwards, and stated that later that day, the couple would return to the UK and would give themselves up to the border control authorities at Lille International train station. He said, quote, "We would prefer to do this since my wife is already sufficiently frightened." Although it was a welcome breakthrough, the police were hesitant to instruct the French police to intercept them, because as long as the Edwards surrendered to the French authorities, then they would remain under French jurisdiction, meaning that the British police would have no power to arrest them. And when the Edwards set foot on British soil, they were arrested and brought to Nottingham for questioning. 3 days later, on November the 2nd, Susan and Christopher Edwards appeared at Nottingham Crown Court, charged with the murder of Patricia and William Wycherley. Though the Edwards had succeeded in maintaining their deception for close to 15 years and siphoning off £250,000, when they were arrested, they owed more than £160,000. They hadn't lived a lavish lifestyle, so where had this money disappeared to? Well, the only clue investigators could find was that both Susan and Christopher seemed to have squandered thousands of pounds purchasing Hollywood memorabilia. It was discovered that Christopher had a mere £17 to his name in his bank account. Susan fared slightly better. She had £11,000. In court, the prosecution never believed that Susan had been visiting her parents alone over the bank holiday weekend. They suggested that Christopher had also been there. They each received a life sentence with a minimum of 25 years. The judge commented that the couple had acted with cold calculation and meticulousness. In February 2015, Susan lost an appeal against a 25-year minimum sentence. HBO and Sky's dramatisation of the story is currently in production. And it'll be a limited 4-part series called Landscapers, which will star Olivia Colman and David Thewlis in the roles of Susan and Christopher. That's it for today. Thank you for watching. And if you like this video, don't forget to leave a comment and like, and click the subscribe button to see future videos. Bye for now.